The penthouse suite on the 42nd floor had always been Alexander Chen's sanctuary from the world, a world he had conquered with ruthless efficiency and unwavering determination. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering city skyline, a constant reminder of everything he had built, everything he owned, everything he controlled. The minimalist decor spoke of wealth so vast it didn't need to announce itself, a single painting worth more than most people's homes, furniture designed by artists whose names were whispered in reverence, marble floors so pristine they reflected the ceiling lights like still water. At 32, Alexander had achieved what most men only dreamed of. His investment firm had turned struggling companies into empires, his decisions moved markets, and his name commanded respect, or fear, in boardrooms across 3 continents. He had built his fortune with his own hands, rising from the ashes of a childhood spent in poverty, swearing never to be powerless again. Money became his armor, success his weapon, and emotional distance his shield. He had never married, never allowed anyone close enough to matter. Relationships were transactions, carefully calculated exchanges where vulnerability was a liability he couldn't afford. His days followed a precise schedule. Wake at 5, exercise for 90 minutes, breakfast while reviewing overnight market reports, office by 7:30, meetings until midnight. Weekends were merely extensions of weekdays, the relentless pursuit of more, leaving no room for anything as frivolous as human connection. The penthouse reflected this philosophy. It was beautiful but cold, impressive but lifeless. No photographs adorned the walls, no personal mementos cluttered the surfaces, no warmth disturbed the perfect aesthetic. It was a monument to achievement and a tomb for the heart. 3 months ago, everything had changed in the most mundane way possible. His previous housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, had retired after 15 years of silent, efficient service. Alexander had barely noticed her presence, which was exactly how he preferred it. The agency sent a replacement, Elena Martinez, 28 years old, recently arrived from a small village in Colombia, with references that spoke of her dedication and discretion. What the references hadn't mentioned was the small girl who would sometimes accompany her mother to work. Isabella was 2 years old, with dark curls that bounced when she moved, enormous brown eyes that seemed to hold entire universes, and a smile that could light up the darkest corners of Alexander's carefully controlled world. Elena had apologized profusely that first day, explaining that her regular childcare had fallen through, promising it wouldn't happen again, her voice trembling with the fear of losing a job she desperately needed. Alexander had nodded curtly, retreating to his study, determined to ignore the intrusion. But Isabella had made ignoring her impossible. She didn't understand boundaries or propriety or the invisible walls that separated a billionaire from a maid's daughter. She only knew curiosity and wonder and the pure, uncomplicated joy of discovery. While Elena worked, Isabella explored, her tiny hands touching everything with gentle reverence, her voice creating a symphony of babbled observations and delighted exclamations. At first, Alexander had been irritated by the disruption to his ordered existence. He would emerge from his study with a sharp comment prepared, only to find Isabella carefully arranging his business magazines by color, or attempting to water his neglected office plant with her sippy cup, or building elaborate towers from his collection of rare books, her face scrunched in concentration. Elena would rush over, scooping up her daughter with whispered apologies in Spanish and English, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. But something in Alexander had begun to shift, some long-frozen part of him cracking like ice in spring. He started working from home more often, though he told himself it was merely convenient. He found himself listening for Isabella's voice, the musical sound of her laughter somehow penetrating the walls he had spent decades constructing. He began leaving his study door open, pretending to work while actually watching the small girl play, mesmerized by her absolute presence in each moment, her complete lack of agenda or calculation. Isabella, for her part, seemed entirely unimpressed by his wealth or status. She didn't know he was important. She didn't care about his power. She only knew that he had interesting things in his apartment and that sometimes, if she smiled at him just right, the serious man's face would soften into something almost human. The transformation had been so gradual that Alexander hadn't noticed it happening. A nod of acknowledgement became a slight smile. A slight smile became a moment of eye contact. Eye contact became the day he had found himself on the floor of his study, showing Isabella how to stack blocks in a way that wouldn't topple, her small hand patting his shoulder in approval when he succeeded. Elena had watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and terror, never quite believing that her employer wouldn't suddenly remember who he was and banish them both from his pristine world. She worked harder than ever, as if perfect service could somehow balance the scales, could make her daughter's presence acceptable. But today was different. Today, Alexander had come home early, exhausted from a particularly brutal series of negotiations that had left him feeling hollowed out and empty. He had loosened his tie, shed his jacket, and collapsed onto the sofa in the living room, a space he rarely used, preferring the isolation of his study. Isabella had been playing on the soft carpet, her mother vacuuming in the adjacent room. The little girl had looked up at Alexander with those enormous eyes, and something in his expression must have called to her, because she had abandoned her toys and toddled over to him, her steps still slightly unsteady, her hand reaching out to pat his knee. "Sad?" she had asked, the word coming out as sod, her face creased with concern that seemed far too profound for someone so small. And Alexander, who never showed weakness, who never let his guard down, who had learned before he was 10 that emotions were dangerous luxuries, had felt his eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. Isabella didn't wait for an answer to her question. In her 2-year-old wisdom, she had already decided what the serious man needed. She grabbed his hand with both of her tiny ones, tugging with determination that far exceeded her physical strength. "Come," she commanded, pulling him toward the carpet where her toys lay scattered like colorful islands across a beige ocean. "Play." Alexander found himself sliding off the sofa and onto the floor, his $1,000 suit pants making contact with the carpet for the first time since he had purchased the penthouse 5 years ago. He couldn't remember the last time he had sat on the floor. Childhood, perhaps, before his mother died and his father's drinking had turned their small apartment into a battlefield. Isabella released his hand and began gathering her toys, bringing them to him one by one like offerings. A stuffed elephant with one ear chewed beyond recognition. A plastic cup filled with crayons. A picture book with pages soft from repeated reading. Each item was presented with grave importance, as if she were sharing her most precious treasures. "This Ellie," she announced, holding up the elephant. "She nice. You hold." Alexander took the worn toy carefully, feeling ridiculous and strangely moved all at once. When was the last time someone had offered him something with no expectation of return? When had anyone trusted him with something they loved? "Hello, Ellie," he said softly, and Isabella's face broke into a smile so radiant it made his chest ache. From the other room, Elena appeared in the doorway, vacuum cleaner forgotten, her hand pressed to her mouth. She had seen Alexander acknowledge her daughter, had even seen him smile slightly, but this was something else entirely. Her employer, the man who commanded empires, was sitting on his living room floor holding a stuffed elephant, and he didn't look angry or annoyed or condescending. He looked gentle. "Mr. Chen, I'm so sorry," Elena began, moving forward to collect Isabella. "Come, Mija, let Mr. Chen rest." "It's fine," Alexander interrupted, surprising himself as much as Elena. "She's not bothering me." Isabella, sensing her mother's intention to remove her from this interesting new development, quickly changed tactics. She circled around behind Alexander, her small hands pressing against his broad back. "Horsey," she declared with absolute authority. "You, be horsey." Elena's face went pale. "Isabella, no. Mr. Chen is not we don't." But Alexander was already laughing, an unfamiliar sound that seemed to shock all three of them. It was rusty, unpracticed, but genuine. The first real laugh he had allowed himself in years. "A horsey?" he asked, looking over his shoulder at the determined little girl. "I don't know if I remember how to be a horsey." Isabella was undeterred by this confession of ignorance. With the confidence of someone who had never been told no, she climbed onto his lower back, her small weight barely registering, her hands gripping his shirt. "Like this," she instructed. "You go like this." She made a bouncing motion, her curls dancing. Alexander looked at Elena, who stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with disbelief. He could see her calculating whether to intervene, whether this moment of unprecedented informality would cost her the job that paid for Isabella's food and clothes and the small apartment they shared with 3 other families. "Is this okay?" he asked her, and the question carried layers of meaning. Was it okay for her daughter to climb on him? Was it okay for the careful distance between employer and employee to dissolve? Was it okay for him to be human? Elena nodded slowly, unable to speak, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. Alexander turned his attention back to Isabella. "All right then," he said, lowering himself onto his hands and knees, feeling his muscles protest this unfamiliar position. "Hold on tight, horsey rider." He began to crawl forward slowly, carefully, acutely aware of the precious cargo on his back. Isabella squealed with delight, her laughter filling the penthouse in a way that no expensive sound system ever could. The sound echoed off the high ceilings and marble floors, bringing life to spaces that had only ever known silence. "Faster," Isabella commanded, patting his shoulder. "Horsey, go fast." Alexander increased his pace slightly, crawling across the living room carpet, past furniture that cost more than most people earned in a year, beneath chandeliers imported from Prague, through a space designed for impressing clients and hosting the occasional business dinner, but never, ever for joy. "Faster, faster." Isabella giggled, bouncing slightly on his back, her small hands tangled in his shirt. He went faster, abandoning dignity entirely, and discovered something shocking. He was having fun. Not the grim satisfaction of closing a profitable deal, not the cold pleasure of defeating a competitor, but actual, pure, uncomplicated fun. His knees would probably hurt tomorrow, his back was already complaining, and he was fairly certain he looked absolutely ridiculous, but Isabella's laughter was the most valuable thing he had heard in years. They made circuits around the coffee table, past the floor-to-ceiling windows with their billion-dollar view, through the space where he had once stood and felt like the king of the world, but had never felt happy. Isabella provided running commentary in her broken toddler syntax, a mixture of Spanish and English and pure imagination. "We go to castle," she announced. "Fast, horsey. Dragon coming." Alexander found himself making galloping sounds, getting into the fantasy. This man who dealt only in facts and figures and cold, hard reality. They raced away from imaginary dragons and toward imaginary castles, and for the first time in decades, Alexander Chin wasn't thinking about the next deal, the next acquisition, the next mountain to conquer. He was simply present, fully inhabiting this moment, this game, this connection with a tiny human who asked nothing of him except participation in her joy. After several minutes, he slowed down, breathing harder than he cared to admit. "The horsey needs rest," he panted, coming to a stop near the sofa. "No," Isabella protested, but he could hear the breathlessness in her voice too. "More horsey." "Just a minute," he negotiated, and to his surprise, she accepted this, sliding off his back and running to retrieve her water bottle from where Elena had set it on the coffee table. Isabella returned with her sippy cup, which was decorated with cartoon characters Alexander didn't recognize and had clearly seen better days. The lid was slightly cracked, the plastic scratched from countless drops and adventures. She stood before him, this tiny person barely tall enough to reach his shoulder as he knelt on the floor, and held out the cup with both hands. "You thirsty?" she stated with absolute certainty. It wasn't a question. She had decided he needed water, and therefore water he would have. Drink. Alexander stared at the offered cup, something enormous and unfamiliar rising in his chest. This child, who had nothing, was offering him everything she had. The water in that cup was probably the only drink she would get until they went home to their crowded apartment. Elena didn't ask for refreshments for herself or Isabella, didn't presume to help herself to anything in his fully stocked kitchen, maintaining the invisible boundary between employer and employee with careful precision. But Isabella didn't understand boundaries. She only understood that the horsey had worked hard and needed water, the same way she needed water after playing, the same way her mama needed water after cleaning. It was simple logic, simple kindness, offered without calculation or expectation. Isabella, no, Elena said quickly, finally finding her voice and stepping forward. That's your water, baby. Mr. Chin has his own. It's okay, Alexander interrupted, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't name. He reached out and accepted the sippy cup from Isabella's small hands. Thank you. He unscrewed the lid because drinking from a sippy cup seemed somehow wrong, like taking a toy from a child. He took a sip of the lukewarm water, and it tasted like redemption. Isabella watched him drink with satisfaction, nodding her approval like a tiny general whose orders had been followed. Good, she said. Now you strong. More horsey. Alexander wanted to laugh and cry simultaneously. This child was worried about his strength, his well-being, his hydration. When was the last time anyone had worried about him? People feared him, respected him, tried to impress him or use him or defeat him, but worried about him? Cared whether he was tired or thirsty or sad. He handed the cup back to her, but she shook her head. You keep. You need. Isabella, Elena said, her voice tight with a mixture of pride and concern for her daughter's presumption. Mr. Chin doesn't need your water. He has. She's right, Alexander said, and he was surprised to find it was true. I do need it. He took another sip, maintaining eye contact with Isabella, who beamed at him like he had just accomplished something remarkable. Thank you, Isabella. You're very kind to share with me. The little girl's smile could have powered the entire city. She threw her arms around his neck in a spontaneous hug, nearly knocking him over, her small body warm and trusting against his chest. Alexander froze, his arms awkwardly hovering, uncertain what to do. He couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged him. Business handshakes, yes. The occasional formal embrace at social functions, calculated and performative. But a real hug, given freely, expecting nothing in return? Slowly, carefully, as if she might shatter. He wrapped his arms around Isabella's small frame and hugged her back. She smelled like baby shampoo and crayons and something indefinably sweet that made his eyes burn again. Okay, horsey, Isabella announced, pulling back and patting his cheek with her small hand. More ride. And so they continued, Alexander crawling across his living room floor, his expensive suit getting wrinkled and dusty, his carefully styled hair falling into his eyes, his dignity absolutely shredded. And he didn't care. With each circuit around the room, something in him was loosening, some tight knot of control and isolation that he had tied when he was barely older than Isabella, swearing never to be vulnerable again. Isabella provided constant encouragement and direction, her vocabulary limited, but her imagination boundless. They weren't just a horsey and rider anymore. They were explorers in the jungle, astronauts on the moon, brave knights seeking adventure. She narrated their journey in her sweet, broken speech, mixing tenses and languages, creating a world where anything was possible. Elena had given up on intervening and had sunk onto the edge of a chair, watching this impossible scene unfold. Tears streamed silently down her face as she witnessed her daughter, her beautiful, innocent daughter, doing what Elena had thought was impossible. Isabella was reaching the man who had seemed unreachable, touching the heart everyone said didn't exist, proving that sometimes the purest form of power wasn't money or influence or control, but simple, uncomplicated love. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, to this moment. Leaving Colombia with her daughter, fleeing poverty and violence, crossing borders both literal and metaphorical, taking jobs that others wouldn't, working hours that left her exhausted, all so that Isabella could have a chance at a better life. She had accepted the position with Mr. Chen because the pay was good and the work was steady, but she had expected nothing more than professional distance and efficient employment. She had never expected this. Her employer on the floor, playing with her daughter, looking more human than she had ever seen him. She had never expected to see the way his expression softened when Isabella laughed, or the way his eyes lit up when her daughter bestowed her approval, or the way he handled her child with such unexpected gentleness. "You good horsey," Isabella declared, patting Alexander's shoulder. "Best horsey." Alexander stopped crawling and sat back on his heels, breathing hard, his face flushed. "Best horsey," he repeated. "Really? Really?" Isabella confirmed solemnly. Then her expression brightened. "You want to see my picture?" Without waiting for an answer, she scrambled off toward her small bag of toys, returning with a piece of paper covered in crayon scribbles. To adult eyes, it was abstract chaos, green and blue and red marks wandering across the page with no discernible pattern. To Isabella, it was clearly a masterpiece. "This you," she said, pointing to a vaguely circular shape. "This me. This mama. This Ellie." She pointed to various scribbles, her face serious as she explained her art. Alexander studied the drawing with the same attention he would give a financial report. "This is beautiful, Isabella. You're a wonderful artist." "You keep it," she decided, pressing the paper into his hands. "For you all." "Isabella, no." Elena protested weakly. "Mr. Chen doesn't want." "I would be honored," Alexander interrupted, and he meant it. He looked at this crayon drawing, probably created in the 30 minutes while Elena vacuumed the bedroom, worth nothing in monetary terms, and saw it for what it was, a gift beyond price. "I'll put it somewhere special." He stood up slowly, his knees protesting, and walked to his study. Isabella followed him like a small shadow, with Elena trailing behind, uncertain whether to stop this surreal progression or simply surrender to it. Alexander's study was his inner sanctum, the place where he conducted the business of empire building, where billion-dollar decisions were made with a stroke of his pen. The walls were lined with expensive art, investments, really pieces chosen by consultants for their value rather than any emotional resonance. Abstract paintings that critics raved about, but that Alexander found cold and meaningless. Photographs of cityscapes and architectural marvels, technically perfect and utterly soulless. He stood before the wall behind his desk, the one he faced whenever he sat in his leather chair, the one that held a particularly valuable abstract painting, slashes of black and red across white canvas, worth more than most people's homes, expressing nothing but the artist's reputation and the buyer's wealth. Without hesitation, Alexander removed the painting from its hooks and leaned it against the wall. In its place, he carefully hung Isabella's crayon drawing, using tape from his desk drawer, positioning it with the same care an art installer would give to a priceless masterpiece. Isabella watched this process with wide eyes, not quite understanding the significance, but sensing that something important was happening. Elena stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her heart, unable to speak. When Alexander stepped back, the crayon scribbles looked absurd in the heavy gold frame space, a child's drawing in a room designed for power and prestige. And yet, it was the first thing in that room that felt real, that had been created with love rather than calculation, that represented connection rather than achievement. "There," Alexander said, satisfaction in his voice. "Perfect. Perfect," Isabella agreed, clapping her small hands together. She wandered over to his desk, trailing her fingers along the polished wood surface, examining the expensive pens in their holder, the sleek computer monitors, the crystal paperweight that caught the light. Alexander watched her, realizing he wasn't worried about her breaking anything. If she broke every valuable item in this room, it would matter less than seeing her smile. "What this?" Isabella asked, pointing to his computer keyboard. "That's how I do my work," Alexander explained, pulling out his desk chair and lifting her up to sit in it. Her small form was swallowed by the large leather seat, her feet dangling far above the floor. "I type on those buttons and do important things." "I try," she asked hopefully. Elena started to protest, but Alexander was already nodding.
"Sure.
"Just press some buttons." Isabella leaned forward, her tongue poking out in concentration, and began pressing keys with both hands. Random letters appeared on the screen, chaotic and meaningless, and absolutely delightful. "I'm working," she announced proudly. "Like you." "Yes, you are," Alexander agreed, standing behind the chair, watching her small hands create gibberish on a screen that usually held financial projections and market analyses. "You're doing very important work." After a few moments of serious typing, Isabella swiveled the chair around to face him, her expression thoughtful. "You have toys?" she asked. Alexander considered this. Did he have toys? He had expensive gadgets, luxury items, objects of status and wealth, but toys? Things meant purely for joy and play? "I don't think so," he admitted. Isabella's face fell slightly, as if she couldn't quite comprehend an existence without toys. Then she brightened. "You come my house. I have toys. We play." The casual invitation, offered with such openness and generosity, hit Alexander like a physical force. She wanted to share her toys with him, wanted him to come to her home, probably a cramped apartment shared with too many people, where her toys were few and precious, because she thought he needed them. Elena gasped softly. "Isabella, we can't. Mr. Chen is very busy. He doesn't have time to." "I would like that very much," Alexander said quietly and meant it. When was the last time he had been invited anywhere without ulterior motive? When had anyone wanted his presence rather than his money or influence? Isabella beamed and reached out her arms, clearly expecting to be picked up. Without thinking, Alexander lifted her from the chair, settling her on his hip as naturally as if he had been doing it all his life. She wrapped her arms around his neck and leaned her head against his shoulder, and Alexander felt something in his chest crack wide open. They stood like that for a long moment, this unlikely pair, the billionaire and the toddler, the man who had everything and nothing, and the child who had nothing and everything. In the window's reflection, Alexander could see them, his expensive suit rumpled and dusty, his hair disheveled, his face softer than it had been in years, and Isabella, small and trusting against his chest, her curls tickling his chin. "You nice," Isabella murmured against his shoulder. "I like you." 4 simple words, stated with the absolute honesty that only a child possesses, and they meant more than every business award, every financial milestone, every acknowledgement of his success that Alexander had ever received. "I like you too," he whispered back, and discovered that he was crying, silent tears sliding down his face, years of loneliness and isolation and carefully maintained emotional distance dissolving in the warmth of a child's uncomplicated affection. Elena saw his tears, and her own fell faster. She understood what was happening, perhaps better than Alexander himself. She had seen wealthy people before, had worked in their homes, had observed their lives from the outside. She had seen their possessions and their privileges, but she had also seen their isolation, their hunger for something money couldn't buy, their yearning for connection they didn't know how to create. And here was her daughter, her beautiful, innocent daughter, giving this powerful man the one thing his billions couldn't purchase: genuine, unconditional love. "Mr. Chen," Elena said softly, "I should get back to work. We've taken up too much of your time." Alexander looked up, his eyes still wet, and shook his head. "Please call me Alexander. And you haven't taken up my time. You've given me something I didn't know I needed." He gently set Isabella down, though she protested with a small whine, clearly not ready to end this wonderful afternoon. He crouched down to her level, his hand gentle on her small shoulder. "I have to do some work now," he told her. "But maybe next time you come, we could play again?" "Promise?" Isabella asked, holding out her pinky finger in the universal gesture of childhood contracts. Alexander stared at that tiny finger, understanding the weight of what she was asking. A promise, given to a child, was sacred. It couldn't be broken by claiming he was too busy, couldn't be dismissed as unimportant, couldn't be delegated to an assistant. He hooked his larger pinky around her small one. "Promise." Isabella's smile was radiant. She leaned forward and kissed his cheek, a sweet, innocent gesture that left him breathless, then skipped out of the study to return to her toys, humming a tuneless song, already moving on to the next moment while Alexander remained kneeling on the floor, his hand pressed to his cheek where her lips had touched, fundamentally changed. That evening, after Elena and Isabella had left, Alexander stood in his penthouse, surrounded by luxury and utterly alone. But the solitude felt different now, heavier, more obvious, less like chosen isolation and more like self-imposed exile. He walked through rooms he rarely used, seeing them with new eyes. The formal dining room with its table for 12 that had never seated more than 6, and those only for business dinners where every word was calculated and every gesture strategic. The living room where he had crawled on the floor like a horse, which now seemed too empty, too quiet, missing something essential. The kitchen, state-of-the-art and barely used because he typically ate at his desk or at restaurants where being seen was part of the agenda. He paused before a mirror in the hallway, studying his reflection. His suit was wrinkled, his hair messed, his eyes slightly red from crying. He looked disheveled and unprofessional and more alive than he had seen himself in years. When had he become this person? This man who lived in a beautiful cage, who had everything except what mattered, who had built walls so high that he had imprisoned himself. He thought about his childhood, before the walls went up. His mother, who had worked 3 jobs to keep them fed, who had come home exhausted but always had time for a bedtime story, whose love had been fierce and unconditional. He remembered sitting on her lap, much like Isabella had sat on his back, feeling safe and precious and seen. Then she died, cancer eating her alive while they couldn't afford the treatment that might have saved her. He was 9 years old. His father, unable to cope with the loss, had turned to alcohol, and the small amount of warmth in their life had evaporated. By the time he was 12, Alexander was essentially raising himself, learning that depending on others was dangerous, that love was a weakness, that the only thing you could trust was money because money didn't leave, didn't die, didn't let you down. He had built his fortune on that foundation of fear and loss, each success another brick in the wall around his heart. He told himself he was protecting himself, that he was being smart, that emotional detachment was strength. But Isabella, with her sippy cup and her crayon drawings and her absolute faith that he was worth sharing with, had shown him the truth. He wasn't strong. He was terrified. Alexander walked to his study and looked at the crayon drawing now hanging on his wall. In the space where a valuable painting had hung, this chaotic scribble of colors proclaimed a different kind of value, the worth of human connection, of joy shared, of love given freely. His phone buzzed with emails, notifications, demands for his attention from people who needed his money or his influence or his approval. He ignored them all and opened a text to his assistant. "Clear my schedule for tomorrow afternoon," he typed. Then, after a pause, he added, "And find out what kind of toys a 2-year-old girl might like." The response came quickly. "Is everything all right, Mr. Chen?" He thought about the question. Was everything all right? His business was thriving, his investments were sound, his wealth continued to grow. By every measure he had used for the past 20 years, everything was more than all right. But he had spent the afternoon on his hands and knees being a horsey, had cried while holding a toddler, had felt more genuine emotion in 3 hours than in the past 3 years. He had been given a crayon drawing and a sip of water from a sippy cup, and they had meant more than his last $10 million. "Everything is perfect," he typed back. "I'm just reordering my priorities." He set down his phone and opened his laptop, but instead of diving into work as he normally would, he found himself searching for information about child development, about how to talk to toddlers, about what kinds of activities were appropriate for 2-year-olds. He, who had never given a thought to children, who had written off the possibility of family as incompatible with his lifestyle, was reading parenting articles at midnight. Around 2 in the morning, he stumbled across research about childhood poverty, about the impact of inadequate childcare on development, about the statistics of children growing up in circumstances like Isabella's. The numbers horrified him. So many children without access to quality early education, without safe places to play, without the resources they needed to thrive. He thought about Isabella in her worn clothes, carrying her cracked sippy cup, treating her few toys like treasures. He thought about Elena, who worked so hard for probably a fraction of what she deserved, who couldn't afford to take a day off even when childcare fell through, who lived with the constant fear of losing the job that kept her daughter fed and housed. Alexander had spent years acquiring wealth, but he had never really thought about what to do with it beyond acquiring more. Philanthropy, when he engaged in it, was strategic: donations that improved his reputation, grants that provided tax benefits, gestures that looked good in business profiles. But what if wealth could mean something different? What if instead of insulation from the world, it could be connection to it? What if instead of a fortress, it could be a bridge? The idea that began forming in his mind was audacious and impractical and would probably horrify his financial advisors. But for the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about return on investment or strategic positioning. He was thinking about a little girl who had shared her water with him, and all the other little girls and boys who needed someone to see them, to value them, to believe they were worth investing in. By the time the sun rose over the city, Alexander had filled a dozen pages with notes and had begun drafting plans for a foundation that would provide childcare and early education to families who couldn't afford it. Not as a tax write-off or a publicity stunt, but as a genuine attempt to ensure that kids like Isabella had the chance to thrive, that mothers like Elena didn't have to choose between work and their children's well-being. He knew it would be complicated, knew he would need to hire people who actually understood early childhood development and social services, knew that throwing money at a problem wasn't enough. But he also knew, with a certainty that felt like coming home, that this was what he wanted to do. This was what his wealth was for. The man in the mirror that morning looked different, still tired, still rumpled from not having slept, but somehow lighter. The weight of isolation was beginning to lift, replaced by something that felt suspiciously like purpose. 3 months later, Alexander stood in the living room of his penthouse, but it looked vastly different from the sterile showplace it had been. A corner of the room now held a basket of toys, nice ones, age-appropriate ones, carefully selected ones, that appeared whenever Isabella visited, which had become a regular occurrence. The arrangement had evolved naturally. Elena still came 3 times a week to clean, but now Alexander insisted she bring Isabella, and he adjusted his schedule to be home during those hours. What had started as awkward tolerance had blossomed into something none of them had quite expected, a kind of chosen family. Alexander had learned to build block towers and make silly voices and appreciate the complex narrative structure of picture books. He had become an expert horsey, though his knees still protested. He had attended his first children's birthday party, one of Isabella's little friends, and discovered that conversing with toddlers was somehow both easier and more challenging than negotiating with corporate titans. More surprisingly, he had become friends with Elena. Real friends, not the employer-employee dynamic they had started with. They talked during his horsey breaks, sharing stories about their lives, their hopes, their fears. She told him about Colombia, about the husband who had died before Isabella was born, about her dreams for her daughter's future. He told her about his mother, about the walls he had built, about the loneliness he was only now beginning to acknowledge. "You're different now," Elena said one afternoon, watching him help Isabella with a puzzle. softer, but also stronger somehow. Alexander considered this. He was different. He smiled more, laughed more, cried more. He had stopped working 16-hour days and started leaving the office at reasonable hours. His colleagues were baffled. His competitors thought he was losing his edge. His friends, the few he had, worried he was having some kind of crisis. But he wasn't losing his edge. He was finding his heart. "Isabella taught me something," he said, helping her fit a puzzle piece into place. "She taught me that power isn't about control or money or influence. It's about connection, about being vulnerable enough to get down on the floor and be a horsey, about accepting water from a sippy cup, about letting someone matter." The foundation he had started, named, at Isabella's insistence, the Horsey Foundation, which his board thought was ridiculous but he refused to change, was already making a difference. They had opened 3 childcare centers in underserved neighborhoods, provided grants to 20 family childcare providers, and were working on a pilot program for subsidized early education. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough, the need was too great, but it was something. And more importantly, it was connected to real people, real children, real families. Alexander visited the centers regularly, not for photo opportunities, but to actually see the work being done, to play with the kids, to understand what they needed. The business press called it his midlife crisis. His board of directors worried he was losing focus. But his company's performance hadn't suffered. If anything, it had improved. Turns out that a man who had rediscovered his humanity made better decisions than one who treated every situation like a battlefield. Today was special, though. Today was Isabella's 3rd birthday, and Alexander had been planning for weeks. The penthouse had been transformed, tastefully, because even in celebration, he couldn't quite abandon his aesthetic sense, with decorations in Isabella's favorite colors. The expensive caterer had been given very specific instructions to create food that a 3-year-old would actually enjoy. The guest list was small: Elena, Isabella, a few of Isabella's little friends from their building, and their mothers, women who had been terrified when Elena first extended the invitation to her employer's penthouse, certain it must be some kind of mistake. But Alexander had welcomed them warmly, had gotten down on the floor to play with their children, had made sure there was food and coffee, and that everyone felt comfortable. He watched these mothers, most of them working multiple jobs, all of them doing their best in difficult circumstances, and saw his own mother reflected in their fierce love and weary determination. When it was time for cake, everyone gathered in the dining room that had finally been used for its intended purpose. Isabella sat at the head of the table in a special chair, wearing a dress that Alexander had bought her. Nothing too extravagant, because Elena had her pride, but nice enough to make the birthday girl feel like a princess. As they sang Happy Birthday, Alexander looked around the table and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: belonging. These people weren't his business associates or his clients or his employees. Not really, not anymore. They were his community, his connection to the world, his reminder that beneath all the wealth and power and achievement, he was simply human. Isabella blew out her candles with enthusiastic determination, making a wish with her eyes squeezed shut. When she opened them, she looked directly at Alexander and smiled, that radiant, transformative smile that had changed everything. "Make wish, Alex," she commanded. She had never managed to say Alexander, instead creating her own nickname that only she used. "I don't think that's how birthday wishes work," he said, laughing. "It's your birthday, so you make the wish." "I wish for you," she announced, clearly not understanding the concept of keeping wishes secret. "I wish you be happy." The room went quiet. Elena's eyes filled with tears. The other mothers exchanged glances, seeing something in this moment that transcended the obvious: a billionaire brought to his knees by a toddler's love. Alexander couldn't speak for a moment, his throat tight with emotion. This child, who had so little, had wished for his happiness. Not for toys or treats or anything for herself, but for him to be happy. "I am happy," he managed to say, his voice rough. Because of you, Isabella. Because you taught me that the greatest power in the world isn't money or success or control. It's love. It's getting down on the floor and being someone's horsey. It's sharing your water, even when you don't have much. It's giving your heart to someone and trusting they'll be careful with it. He looked at Elena, at the other mothers, at their children playing with toys he had bought, but that had been chosen with love rather than calculation. You've all taught me that. You've shown me what matters. Isabella didn't understand most of his words, but she understood the feeling behind them. She climbed down from her chair and ran to him, launching herself into his arms with complete trust that he would catch her. And he did, holding her close, this small girl who had saved him without even trying. "Love you, Alex," she said against his shoulder, the words slightly muffled but perfectly clear. "I love you too, Isabella," he whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Later, after the party had wound down and most of the guests had left, Alexander sat on a sofa with Isabella curled up against him, drowsy from cake and excitement. Elena was in the kitchen, insisting on helping clean up despite Alexander's protests. "Best birthday ever," Isabella murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "Best birthday ever," Alexander agreed, though it wasn't his birthday. But in a way, it was a rebirth, a transformation from who he had been to who he was becoming. He looked around his penthouse, which had finally become a home. The expensive art-shared wall space with children's drawings. The pristine furniture bore the marks of actually being lived on. The silence had been replaced with laughter and conversation, and the chaotic noise of life being fully lived. He thought about the man he had been 6 months ago, alone in his fortress, powerful and wealthy and utterly empty. That man would never have gotten down on the floor. That man would never have accepted water from a sippy cup. That man would never have cried in front of anyone, would never have admitted to loneliness or fear or need. That man had thought he was strong, but he had been wrong. True strength wasn't in walls and isolation and emotional control. True strength was in vulnerability, in openness, in allowing yourself to be changed by a 2-year-old's laughter. Isabella had taught him that the greatest power in the world wasn't the kind that commanded empires or moved markets. It was the power of innocent love, freely given and gratefully received. It was the power to transform a heart that had been frozen for decades. It was the power to look at a man surrounded by everything and see that he had nothing, and then, with simple gestures and genuine affection, give him everything that mattered. As Isabella's breathing deepened into sleep, Alexander held her carefully, this precious child who had saved his life without even knowing it needed saving. Outside the windows, the city glittered with ambition and achievement and the endless pursuit of more. But inside this room, in this moment, Alexander Chen, billionaire, businessman, former emotional fortress, had finally found what all his wealth could never buy, a sense of home, of family, of love that asked nothing except to be received. And in the sweet weight of a sleeping child against his chest, in the sound of Elena humming in his kitchen, in the crayon drawings on his walls and the toys in his living room, he understood that Isabella had been right all along. Sometimes the greatest power in the world comes in the smallest packages, speaks in the simplest words, and asks only that you be willing to get down on the floor and play.